Ambassador Susan Rice, National Security Advisor and Ambassador to the UN under President Obama. And Ambassador Rice, let's pick up just where Tom Bossert just left off right there. He said what you should look at is how tough the president and his administration have been, toughest sanctions yet on Russia. That's what matters.
Well, George, good morning. I think what Tom is ignoring, with all due respect, is the fact that the sanctions that the president and the administration have imposed on Russia only came as a result of a congressional mandate that required him to do so. The president has cast doubt repeatedly, including this week, on the legitimacy of the unanimous intelligence community finding that Russia directly interfered in our elections. He has undermined NATO. He's called the European Union a foe. He's imposed harsh tariffs on our closest allies. He's withdrawn us from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. He's taken a series of steps that, had Vladimir Putin dictated them, he couldn't have mirrored more effectively. What his motivations are, I think, is a legitimate question, one that I trust that the special counsel is investigating. But the policies that this president has pursued globally have served Vladimir Putin's interests in dividing the West, undermining democracy, increasing fissures within NATO, and has done very little to advance U.S. interests.
You mentioned the president's motivations. Does that mean you think it's an open question whether or not he's compromised by Russia?
George, I don't know what his motivations are. I think that's a legitimate question, and it has been reinforced not only by the series of policy steps that I just mentioned that he's taken that have served Russian interests as opposed to U.S. interests, but it was also reinforced, sadly, this week by that tragic display of sycophancy in Helsinki, where the president called into question yet again, standing next to Vladimir Putin, a dictator, the integrity of our intelligence community. He offered for, or he seemed to be willing to consider an offer to hand over our ambassador to Russia, former Ambassador Michael McFaul, and others to the Russians for questioning. I mean, it was a series of extraordinary capitulations that really do legitimately call into question what is going on.
We've heard from the Russians about what they think were the agreements in Helsinki, talking some preliminary agreements on Syria, perhaps on Ukraine as well. We just heard Tom Bossert say he's been informed that there were no agreements, but we haven't heard that much from the administration in public. What exactly do you think we need to know about those 2 hours between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump?
George, we need to know everything, and the president's national security team needs to know everything. It was a historic mistake to allow the president of the United States, not just Donald Trump, but any president, frankly, to sit for 2 hours without any note takers, without any aides present, with one of the most adversarial leaders of the world relative to the United States. We have no idea what transpired, and very predictably, the Russians are feeding their line of what happened. We are hearing no rebuttal or comment from the United States. Russia is dictating the public perception, the global public perception of what transpired in that meeting, and we have no basis for countering it. It's a very, very uncomfortable and indeed dangerous situation for the United States to be in. There never should have been a one-on-one meeting of any length, and now we are left to wonder, and even the president's cabinet members are left to wonder, what exactly happened.
How about the idea that we have to engage Russia? They're an important country on the world scene. They're clearly an adversary in places like Syria, important in North Korea, and that's why we need to engage, we need to talk to them, and even, as Tom Bossert said, a second summit may make sense.
Well, George, I don't think a second summit, particularly at the White House, makes sense anytime soon, certainly not in light of what has happened this week. But I'm not opposed to the notion of engaging the Russians, whether we engage them as we must on a daily basis, as I did, and as Ambassador Haley does at the United Nations, or whether the leaders themselves meet from time to time. The problem with this encounter was as follows. First of all, it really was best organized as a more informal discussion on the margins of some multilateral meeting, whether that would have been the United Nations General Assembly meeting coming up in September or the G20. It didn't need to be a standalone summit with all sorts of pomp and circumstance. It certainly didn't need to entail a one-on-one meeting without note takers for 2 hours, which, as I mentioned, was a very serious mistake. There are things to discuss with the Russians, but we should have come into that meeting very well prepared, pressing our grave concern about Russian interference in our elections, using the indictment, which Mueller had just laid down, to reinforce the veracity of our case. We should have pressed on issues like North Korea, Syria, Ukraine, not take Vladimir Putin's line on these issues, but rather to advance our interests and our objectives. There's no inherent problem with two leaders, even from hostile countries, engaging in dialogue. I support that, but you must come prepared. You must come to advance the United States agenda, not to lie prostrate for the Russian agenda.
As you know, President Trump says it's the fault of President Obama and his predecessors. The U.S.-Russia relations are his fault. He had that tweet coming into the first summit talking about U.S. foolishness and stupidity. He called President Obama a total patsy for Putin.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of language is ridiculous. It's offensive, and it doesn't, frankly, reflect well on President Trump. Any American president should stand up for the United States of America in the present and historically when meeting with Vladimir Putin. It was President Obama who led the United States and our European allies to impose very strong sanctions on Russia for its annexation of Crimea and its invasion of Ukraine. It's President Trump who's suggested that Crimea belongs properly to Russia and that he'd be prepared to consider some accommodation for Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine. So, you know, President Trump can throw all kinds of epithets around. It seems that's how he likes to govern. But the facts are the facts, and the reality is that the United States, on a bipartisan basis, needs to be unified in its opposition to Russia's policies, to its efforts to undermine our democracy and our domestic political discourse. And we shouldn't be casting aspersions on one's predecessors. We should be looking Putin squarely in the eye and delivering the message that supports United States interests, not Russian interests.
Ambassador Rice, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, George.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.